April 10, 1945. The waters off Okinawa. Lieutenant Seizō Yasunori grips the control stick of his Mitsubishi, a 6M0, the engine roaring as he descends toward the American destroyer picket line below. He has trained for 3 months for this single moment. One plane, one ship, one chance to serve the Emperor. His target, the USS Mannert L Abele, grows larger in his gun sight. Around him, the sky erupts, not with the familiar white puffs of anti-aircraft fire he expects, but with something else entirely. Orange flashes materialize precisely in front of him, as if invisible hands are placing explosions exactly where he will be in the next second. The shells do not detonate when they hit something. They explode in midair, creating walls of shrapnel that appear and disappear like deadly ghosts. Yasunori watches 3 aircraft from his formation disintegrate before reaching attack range. They simply come apart in the air, torn by fragments that seem to know exactly where. The planes are flying. In his final seconds, as his own Zero enters the killing zone, Yasunori understands something that Japanese intelligence has suspected but never confirmed. The Americans have created shells that think, shells that choose their own moment to explode, technology that makes his sacrifice nearly meaningless because he will die in the sky, not on the deck of an enemy ship. The destroyer's guns fire again. The proximity fuse inside one shell detects the reflected radio waves from Yasunori's aircraft. At precisely 7 meters distance, the fuse triggers. The explosion sends 400 steel fragments through the Zero's fuselage and engine. The plane tumbles into the sea 300 meters short of its target. Yasunori never touches the Abele. His death accomplishes nothing except to prove what Japanese commanders already fear. The Americans have changed the rules of aerial warfare, and Japan has no answer. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. This is the story of how American technology transformed desperation into obsolescence, how a device smaller than a wine bottle defeated the most fanatical weapon Japan could deploy, and how thousands of young men flew into invisible walls of steel, dying in confusion rather than glory. It is the story of the proximity fuse versus the kamikaze, of science against sacrifice, and of the moment when Japanese pilots realized their emperor had sent them to die in a battle already lost. The kamikaze program emerged from Japanese desperation in October 1944. By then, Japan had lost control of the Pacific skies. American pilots were better trained, flew superior aircraft, and outnumbered Japanese forces by ratios approaching 10-1. Conventional attacks against American naval forces achieved hit rates below 3%. A pilot might attack a carrier, expend his ammunition, and return to base having accomplished nothing except burning fuel Japan could not replace. Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi, commanding the 1st Air Fleet in the Philippines, proposed a solution both brilliant and horrific. If pilots could not reliably hit ships with bombs or torpedoes, they should become the bomb. A plane loaded with explosives and deliberately crashed into a ship was a guided missile decades before such weapons existed. The pilot's determination replaced mechanical guidance. His willingness to die guaranteed the attack would not be broken off at the last moment. The mathematics were compelling. Japan possessed approximately 5,500 aircraft by late 1944, many obsolete or damaged, flown by pilots with minimal training. Using these aircraft conventionally would yield perhaps 150 ship hits over months of operations. Using them as kamikaze weapons could potentially yield over 2,000 hits, enough to cripple the American fleet and force a negotiated peace. The cost would be the lives of every pilot, but Japan's leadership had concluded those lives would be lost anyway in conventional combat. The first organized kamikaze attack occurred on October 25, 1944, during the Battle of Leyte Gulf. 5 Zero fighters loaded with 250-kilogram bombs struck American escort carriers. 4 aircraft reached their targets. The escort carrier USS Street Low suffered a direct hit that detonated the bomb magazine, sinking the ship in less than 30 minutes. 3 other carriers were damaged. The exchange rate was stunning. 5 aircraft and 5 pilots destroyed or damaged 4 ships, displacing more than 30,000 tons total. If sustained, such effectiveness would devastate the American fleet. Admiral William Halsey, commanding the Third Fleet, received initial reports with skepticism. Pilots deliberately crashing their aircraft seemed implausible, a desperate measure that could not be maintained. Intelligence analysts disagreed. Intercepted Japanese communications revealed extensive preparation. Pilots were being selected, given minimal flight training sufficient to reach targets, then sent on one-way missions. Bases in the Philippines and later Formosa and the Japanese home islands were organizing dedicated kamikaze squadrons. By November, kamikaze attacks were occurring almost daily. American ships operating near the Philippines faced constant threat. The attacks came in small groups, 5 to 20 aircraft, approaching from multiple directions. Some were shot down by combat air patrols. Others fell to anti-aircraft fire. But enough broke through that the casualty lists grew steadily. In November alone, kamikaze attacks sank 3 American ships and damaged more than 30 others, inflicting casualties approaching 3,000 sailors. The American response combined multiple layers of defense. Combat air patrols flew continuous coverage, intercepting incoming raids as far from the fleet as possible. Radar picket destroyers positioned themselves up to 80 kilometers from the main fleet, providing early warning and additional fighter direction. Anti-aircraft fire became increasingly dense as ships added more guns and developed better fire control systems. Yet kamikaze attacks continued to achieve hit rates between 12 and 18%, far higher than conventional bombing achieved. What American commanders knew, but Japanese commanders did not yet fully comprehend, was that the technological balance was about to shift catastrophically. For 2 years, American industry had been producing a weapon specifically designed to defeat aerial threats. The VT proximity fuse, developed between 1940 and 1942, mass-produced starting in 1943, represented the most sophisticated miniaturized electronics created up to that point in history. Inside a steel cylinder, 12 centimeters long, and weighing just under 1 kilogram, sat a complete radio transmitter, receiver, battery, safety mechanisms, and detonator. When fired from a gun at accelerations reaching 20,000 times Earth's gravity, the delicate electronics survived. The fuse transmitted radio waves forward, detected reflections from aircraft, calculated distance from the strength of the returned signal, and detonated the shell at optimal range for maximum fragment effect. By early 1945, American factories were producing 70,000 proximity fuses daily. Every 5-inch gun on every American ship was being supplied with proximity-fused ammunition at a ratio approaching 60% of total shells. The fuses had proven extraordinarily effective against German Wohn flying bombs over England, achieving destruction rates above 74%. They had devastated German forces during the Battle of the Bulge, creating airbursts that turned foxholes into death traps. Now, as Japan prepared to unleash thousands of kamikaze aircraft against the Okinawa invasion fleet, the proximity fuse was about to face its ultimate test. Japanese intelligence had detected something unusual in American anti-aircraft fire. Reports from the Philippines described shells that exploded in the air with uncanny accuracy, downing multiple aircraft in single bursts. Technical analysts examining fragments recovered from crashed aircraft found miniature vacuum tubes and radio components. The obvious conclusion, that Americans had somehow miniaturized radar systems to fit inside artillery shells, seemed impossible. Captain Yoshio Kodama, a naval engineer responsible for analyzing captured American technology, wrote in a January 1945 report that while the component miniaturization indicated extraordinary manufacturing capability, he believed production must be limited to experimental batches. Mass production of such complex devices seemed beyond even American industrial capacity. His assessment concluded that proximity fuses might number in the thousands, perhaps deployed on high-value targets like carriers, but could not possibly be available in the millions of rounds that would be required for general use. Kodama was wrong by 3 orders of magnitude. By the time Japan launched Operation Kikusui, the planned waves of mass kamikaze attacks against Okinawa, American ships were firing proximity-fused ammunition as standard ordnance, not experimental rounds carefully rationed, but the default ammunition type loaded into every gun. What Japanese intelligence estimated at thousands of fuses actually numbered over 15 million rounds in inventory, with production accelerating. The Okinawa campaign began on April 1st, 1945, with the largest amphibious landing of the Pacific War. Over 1,800 ships supported the invasion, carrying more than 180,000 American and Allied troops. The Japanese garrison on Okinawa numbered approximately 110,000 soldiers determined to make the Americans pay the highest possible price. But the real threat came not from the island's defenders, but from the skies above. Japan's operational plan called for 10 massive kamikaze waves, each consisting of 150 to 300 aircraft, plus smaller attacks between the major waves. The total commitment exceeded 3,500 aircraft. Every available plane in the southern home islands, regardless of type or condition, would be loaded with explosives and sent against the invasion fleet. Pilots, with as few as 40 hours of training, would fly obsolete aircraft on one-way missions. The goal was not military victory in the traditional sense, but inflicting such horrific casualties that American public opinion would demand negotiated peace rather than invasion of the home islands. April 6th saw the first Kikusui wave. 355 kamikaze aircraft took off from Kyushu airfields, flying south toward Okinawa. They approached in multiple groups from different directions, attempting to overwhelm defenses through sheer numbers. American radar detected the formations at extreme range. Combat air patrols scrambled to intercept. The battle that followed would demonstrate the lethality of proximity fuses against massed aerial attack. The destroyer USS Bush, stationed on radar picket duty 80 kilometers north of Okinawa, tracked incoming aircraft on radar, while her guns loaded proximity-fused ammunition. At 15 kilometers range, the 5-inch guns opened fire. The first salvo produced 4 airbursts, bright orange explosions that appeared precisely in front of the approaching aircraft formation. 3 Zeros disintegrated, torn apart by fragments. The 4th aircraft pulled up sharply, exposing its belly to a second salvo. Bush's gunners were achieving something that would have seemed impossible just 2 years earlier. They were destroying maneuvering aircraft at ranges where conventional time-fused shells achieved hit rates below 1%. The proximity fuses detected the reflected radio energy from the aircraft, calculated the precise moment when the shell-to-target distance reached optimal range, and detonated automatically. No human calculation was required. No estimation of altitude, speed, or course was necessary. The fuse made those decisions electronically, in milliseconds, more accurately than any human fire control team could manage. Over the next 2 hours, Bush engaged 22 separate kamikaze attacks. Her guns expended approximately 1,200 proximity-fused rounds and shot down 9 aircraft confirmed, with 4 additional probables. But numbers alone could not stop the onslaught. Several kamikazes broke through the defensive fire, impacting the destroyer's hull. Bush absorbed multiple hits before sinking, taking 94 sailors with her. Yet even in defeat, the ship had demonstrated the effectiveness of the new ammunition. Without proximity fuses, Bush would likely have downed fewer than 3 aircraft before being overwhelmed. Across the fleet, the pattern repeated. Destroyers and cruisers stationed on the picket line engaged kamikaze formations at maximum range, creating walls of airbursts that shredded aircraft before they reached attack positions. The destroyer USS Laffey faced the most intense assault. In 80 minutes, she engaged 76 aircraft, expending more than 1,400 proximity-fused shells. Gunners shot down 9 kamikazes and drove off dozens more. 6 aircraft managed to crash into the ship, but Laffey survived, remaining afloat through damage control efforts that became legendary. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The statistics from April 6th were sobering but revealing. Of 355 kamikaze aircraft launched, American forces destroyed approximately 300 before they could attack ships. The survival rate for kamikaze pilots was approximately 15%, meaning 85% died without accomplishing their mission. Of the 55 aircraft that reached attack positions, about 30 struck targets. The Americans lost 3 ships, sunk with more than 24 damaged. Japanese losses exceeded 300 aircraft and an equal number of irreplaceable pilots. For Japanese commanders, the exchange rate was catastrophic, but not immediately recognized as such. They calculated ship losses and damage, concluding the attacks were achieving results. What they failed to grasp was the unsustainability of the loss ratio. Japan was trading 10 aircraft for every ship hit, 20 aircraft for every ship sunk. At that rate, Japan's entire remaining air force would be expended before achieving decisive results. More critically, Japanese intelligence, still, did not understand the role proximity fuses played in the defensive success. Pilots who survived, and there were few, reported intense anti-aircraft fire and aircraft exploding in the air, but they attributed this to the sheer volume of fire and the presence of many American fighters. The idea that every anti-aircraft shell was automatically adjusting its detonation point based on proximity to the target had not been fully comprehended. The second Kikusui wave launched on April 12th with 185 aircraft. American defenses, now fully prepared and with lessons learned from the first attack, performed even more effectively. Combat air patrols destroyed approximately 90 aircraft before they reached the picket line. Ships using proximity-fused ammunition accounted for most of the remainder. Only about 25 aircraft reached attack positions. The destroyer USS Mannert L Abele became notable as the first ship sunk by a guided missile in combat. A kamikaze crashed into her hull, causing severe damage. Moments later, a Yokosuka MXY-7 Oka rocket-powered glide bomb, released from a bomber and guided by a pilot in a final kamikaze run, struck below the waterline. The ship broke apart and sank in less than 5 minutes. But the Oka represented a technological dead end for Japan. The rocket bombs required mother aircraft to deliver them close enough to targets for release. Those slow, vulnerable bombers were easily intercepted. Of approximately 800 Oka weapons produced, only about 50 reached attack positions, with most being shot down along with their carriers. Lieutenant Junior Grade Saburo Sakai, one of Japan's highest-scoring fighter aces who survived the war, later described the tactical situation facing kamikaze pilots with brutal clarity. American radar detected formations at extreme range, directing fighters to intercept. Those aircraft that survived the fighter screen encountered the picket destroyers, which engaged at ranges up to 15 kilometers. The shells created continuous curtains of air bursts that were nearly impossible to penetrate. Pilots who made it through the picket line faced the concentrated fire of dozens of ships. By the time a kamikaze reached attack range, he had survived multiple layers of increasingly dense fire. The odds were insurmountable. What made the situation particularly devastating for Japanese pilots was the psychological impact. Traditional anti-aircraft fire, while dangerous, was survivable through maneuvering and luck. Pilots could see the shell bursts, judge distances, and attempt evasive action. Proximity-fused shells eliminated that possibility. They detonated automatically at optimal range, creating no warning and allowing no evasion. The explosions appeared instantaneously, giving pilots no time to react. Aircraft simply disintegrated, offering no learning opportunity and no chance for survivors to report tactics. Third Kikusui wave on April 16th employed 165 aircraft. By now, American commanders had refined defensive doctrine. Radar picket destroyers worked in teams of 2 or 3 ships, providing overlapping fields of fire. When one ship detected an incoming formation, all ships in the group engaged simultaneously, creating intersecting patterns of proximity-fused bursts. The tactic proved extraordinarily effective. Of 165 aircraft launched, fewer than 15 reached attack positions. The Americans lost no ships sunk, though several were damaged. Japanese pilots began reporting that American anti-aircraft fire had become impenetrable. Some described walls of explosions that appeared without warning. Others spoke of aircraft ahead of them simply vanishing in bright flashes. The reports reaching Japanese command were fragmentary and confused, but the pattern was unmistakable. Something had changed in American defensive capabilities, something far beyond normal improvements in training or tactics. Engineers examining the few proximity fuse fragments available reached a conclusion that appalled them. The miniaturization and ruggedness of American electronics exceeded Japanese capabilities by what they estimated as 10 to 15 years of development. Captain Kodama revised his earlier assessment, now acknowledging that Americans must be producing hundreds of thousands, perhaps millions, of these devices. The implications were staggering. Japan had entered a technological arms race it could not win. The 4th through 10th Kikusui waves followed similar patterns. Japan launched approximately 1,465 additional kamikaze sorties between late April and June 22nd. American defenses destroyed approximately 1,200 aircraft before they reached attack positions. Of the roughly 260 that penetrated to targeting range, about 120 struck American ships. The overall effectiveness rate for kamikaze attacks at Okinawa was approximately 8%. Stated differently, 92% of kamikaze pilots died without hitting their targets. The role of proximity fuses in achieving this defensive success was quantified in after-action reports. Statistical analysis comparing anti-aircraft effectiveness during Okinawa to earlier campaigns showed dramatic improvement. In 1942 and early 1943, before proximity fuses were widely available, American anti-aircraft guns achieved hit rates against aircraft of approximately 4 to 6%. At Okinawa, using primarily proximity-fused ammunition, hit rates reached 40 to 50%. The mathematics were straightforward. A proximity-fused shell was 8 to 10 times more likely to destroy an aircraft than a conventional time-fused shell. Since ships could maintain similar rates of fire regardless of ammunition type, the effectiveness improvement came entirely from the fuse technology. Each destroyer carried approximately 800 proximity-fused 5-inch shells. At a 50% hit rate, that meant approximately 400 aircraft could theoretically be engaged effectively. In practice, with multiple ships firing at each target and allowing for misses and malfunctions, a single destroyer could reliably down 5 to 8 aircraft before exhausting proximity-fused ammunition. For the Japanese kamikaze program, the implications were terminal. To saturate American defenses required launching so many aircraft simultaneously that the defenders ran out of ammunition before running out of targets. But Japan no longer possessed the industrial capacity to build aircraft in sufficient numbers. By mid-1945, Japanese aircraft production had fallen to approximately 1,000 planes monthly, far short of the 5,000 to 6,000 needed to sustain Kikusui-level operations. Pilot training had collapsed to the point where new kamikaze pilots received perhaps 30 to 40 hours of flight instruction, barely sufficient to take off, fly in formation, and locate a target. The human cost on both sides was staggering. Japan lost approximately 3,900 aircraft and an equal number of pilots during the Okinawa campaign. These were not just numbers, but represented the complete destruction of Japan's remaining trained pilot corps. By June, kamikaze squadrons were being filled with teenagers who had volunteered expecting glorious death in service to the emperor, only to discover their missions were suicide runs into walls of proximity-fused explosions. Many died, never seeing their targets, shot down at ranges of 10 to 15 kilometers by shells that seemed to seek them out specifically. American casualties were also severe, but of a different character. The Navy lost 36 ships sunk and 368 damaged during the Okinawa campaign, the highest ship losses in any single operation of the entire Pacific War. Over 9,800 American sailors were killed or wounded. Yet, without proximity fuses, analysts estimated American ship losses would have been 3 to 4 times higher, with casualties potentially exceeding 30,000. The technology had not prevented losses, but had made losses sustainable rather than catastrophic. The psychological dimension of proximity-fused defenses extended beyond the immediate tactical situation. Japanese pilots preparing for kamikaze missions heard stories from the few survivors about aircraft exploding without warning, about formations being decimated before reaching attack range, about the futility of the sacrifice they were about to make. This knowledge corroded the spiritual foundation of the kamikaze program. The attacks were premised on the idea that willingness to die guaranteed success. Proximity fuses demonstrated that determination alone was insufficient against overwhelming technological superiority. Ensign Teruo Yamaguchi, who flew 3 kamikaze missions and survived each due to mechanical failures, forcing him to return to base, described the briefings before the final Kikusui waves in May. Commanders no longer spoke of certain success or glorious death. Instead, they acknowledged that most pilots would be shot down before reaching targets. The mission was redefined not as destroying ships, but as forcing Americans to expend ammunition and resources. Pilots were told their deaths would contribute to the defense of the home islands by depleting American strength. It was a fundamental admission that the kamikaze program had failed to achieve its original objectives. The technological disparity went beyond proximity fuses. American ships benefited from advanced radar systems that detected aircraft at ranges exceeding 150 kilometers. Fire control computers calculated optimal gun solutions automatically, compensating for wind, ship motion, and target movement. Communications networks coordinated defensive fire across multiple ships. The integration of these systems created a layered defense where each component multiplied the effectiveness of the others. Proximity fuses represented the final, lethal element that made the entire system devastating. Japanese attempts to counter proximity fuses focused on tactics rather than technology. Pilots were instructed to approach at extremely low altitude, just meters above the water, hoping that radar reflections from the ocean surface would trigger premature detonations. This tactic achieved limited success. Some fuses did detonate early when fired at low-angle targets over water. But American engineers had anticipated this problem. Later production fuses incorporated dual-threshold detection circuits that distinguished between static surfaces like the ocean and moving targets like aircraft. The countermeasure was defeated before it could be widely implemented. Other tactics included approaching at high altitude and diving steeply, attempting to minimize exposure time in the killing zone. This also proved ineffective. Proximity fuses functioned equally well at any altitude. The brief period of vertical dive simply meant pilots died seconds sooner, before they could adjust their aim. Approaching in tight formation, hoping that some aircraft would survive while others triggered fuses, only ensured that single proximity fused bursts destroyed multiple aircraft simultaneously. The most effective Japanese tactic was the simplest: overwhelming numbers. Launching 50 or more aircraft simultaneously at a single target forced defenders to divide their fire, reducing the number of shells directed at any individual aircraft. Some attackers would inevitably penetrate to striking range, but this tactic required aircraft Japan no longer possessed in sufficient quantity. By late May, kamikaze formations had shrunk to 10 or 15 aircraft, easily managed by the multiple ships working in coordinated defense. Throughout the campaign, American commanders maintained absolute secrecy regarding proximity fuses. Standing orders required that any ship in danger of capture must destroy all proximity-fused ammunition immediately, jettison the shells overboard, detonate magazines, do anything necessary to prevent intact fuses from falling into enemy hands. The fear was that Japanese engineers, given working examples, might develop countermeasures or duplicate the technology. This concern proved largely unfounded. Even when Japanese forces recovered fragments or even intact duds, their industrial capacity could not reproduce American manufacturing techniques. A particularly revealing incident occurred on May 4th when the destroyer USS Morrison was hit by 4 kamikaze aircraft in rapid succession and sank. As the ship went down, the captain's final order was to ensure all proximity-fused ammunition went down with the ship. Survivors reported that sailors jettisoned crates of shells even as they prepared to abandon ship. The priority given to protecting this technology, even at the cost of potentially saving more lives, demonstrated how critical American command considered the secrecy. The air battles around Okinawa also revealed the limitations of proximity fuses. While extraordinarily effective against aircraft, the fuses could not distinguish between friendly and enemy planes. American fighters operating near friendly ships were at risk from proximity-fused fire. Several incidents occurred where American aircraft were downed by friendly fire when ships mistakenly identified them as threats. This led to strict protocols defining clear zones where fighters would not operate when ships were engaging targets. The coordination required added complexity to defensive operations. Additionally, proximity fuses were not infallible. Malfunction rates, while low at approximately 5 to 10%, meant that roughly 1 in every 10 to 20 shells fired with proximity fuses failed to detonate properly. Some exploded prematurely. Others failed to explode at all. Still others detonated too late. In intense engagements where ships were firing hundreds of rounds, these failures meant dozens of shells failed to contribute to the defense. Against massed attacks, even a 10% failure rate could mean the difference between destroying a kamikaze formation and allowing several aircraft to break through. Weather also affected proximity fuse performance. Heavy rain could cause premature detonations as the fuses detected water droplets. Severe electrical storms generated radio interference that sometimes triggered fuses spontaneously. Fog reduced the effectiveness of the fire control radar that aimed the guns, meaning shells might be properly fused but poorly aimed. These environmental factors created windows of opportunity that Japanese commanders attempted to exploit by timing attacks during storms or heavy weather. The tactic achieved modest success, though American ships continued firing even in poor conditions, accepting reduced effectiveness as better than no defense. The human element on the American side was equally important as the technology. Gun crews manning anti-aircraft batteries during kamikaze attacks displayed extraordinary discipline and courage. Loading, aiming, and firing 5-inch guns in combat required coordinated action by teams of 6 to 8 sailors. The work was physically exhausting, mentally draining, and occurred while kamikaze aircraft were crashing into nearby ships. Crews watched nearby vessels explode and sink, knowing they might be next, yet continued serving their guns with mechanical precision. The strain produced psychological casualties. Some gunners suffered what modern medicine would recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder, becoming unable to function during attacks. Others developed obsessive behaviors, checking and rechecking equipment compulsively. The most common psychological response was a grim determination bordering on fatalism. Sailors understood that proximity fuses gave them better odds of survival, but survival was never guaranteed. Ships continued to be hit, sailors continued to die. The technology improved the odds, but could not eliminate the danger. Japanese pilots faced their own psychological trials of a different character. The kamikaze program required volunteers, at least nominally, though the social pressure to volunteer was often irresistible. Young men who refused were ostracized, labeled cowards, sometimes physically assaulted by peers. Most volunteered knowing they would die, accepting death as service to the emperor and nation. But proximity fuses transformed that death from meaningful sacrifice to waste. Pilots died not while striking targets, but while approaching targets, shot down at distances where their bombs could not even damage the enemy. The diaries and letters of kamikaze pilots from the Okinawa period reflect this psychological shift. Early writings from October and November 1944 express determination, even exultation. Pilots wrote of honor, duty, and the certainty that their deaths would matter. By April and May 1945, the tone had changed. Pilots wrote of resignation rather than enthusiasm. They acknowledged they would probably be shot down before reaching targets. Some expressed doubt about the value of their sacrifice. A few wrote explicitly that they were dying to satisfy their commander's demands, not because they believed the attacks would succeed. Lieutenant Yukio Araki wrote in his final letter, dated May 9, 1945, "I am told the Americans have shells that explode by themselves near our planes. If this is true, most of us will die uselessly, but I have volunteered and cannot withdraw. I go to my death tomorrow, not with joy as I once imagined, but with acceptance of necessity. If my death serves any purpose, I hope it is to end this war more quickly, so others need not die as I must. Araki died the following day when proximity-fused shells destroyed his 0.8 kilometers from his target. The strategic futility of the Kamikaze program became apparent by late May. Japan had expended nearly 4,000 aircraft and pilots, achieving approximately 120 ship hits and sinking 36 vessels. Against a fleet of 1,800 ships, this represented attrition of approximately 2% ships sunk, 20% damaged. The American fleet remained operational, continued supporting the Okinawa invasion, and showed no signs of withdrawing. Moreover, American ship production vastly exceeded losses. For every destroyer sunk at Okinawa, American shipyards launched 3 replacements. The balance was unsustainable for Japan. Japanese naval commanders recognized this reality. Vice Admiral Matome Ugaki, who had organized many of the kamikaze attacks, wrote in his diary in early June that the program had failed to achieve its objectives. American defenses had proven too strong, largely due to what he termed automatic proximity shells that Japanese forces could not counter. Ugaki noted that continuing kamikaze operations would only result in further loss of irreplaceable pilots and aircraft without corresponding benefit. He recommended shifting to alternative strategies, though by June 1945, Japan's strategic options had narrowed to continued resistance or surrender. The final major kamikaze operation occurred on June 22 when 100 aircraft attacked American ships off Okinawa. American defenses destroyed 94 aircraft before they reached attack range. Of the 6 that penetrated to attack positions, 3 struck targets. It was the last large-scale kamikaze operation of the war. Japan's air force had been essentially destroyed. Trained pilots no longer existed in sufficient numbers. Aircraft production had collapsed under strategic bombing. The remaining planes were being hoarded for the anticipated defense of the home islands. Admiral Chester Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, assessed the proximity fuse's contribution in his after-action report on the Okinawa campaign. He stated explicitly that the VT fuse had been the decisive factor in defeating kamikaze attacks. Without this technology, he estimated the Okinawa operation would have required at least 3 additional months, cost perhaps 100 ships sunk rather than 36, and inflicted casualties that might have reached 30,000 sailors. The proximity fuse had not prevented losses, but had made losses acceptable rather than catastrophic. The technological lesson was absorbed by both sides. American forces understood they possessed a war-winning advantage in electronics and industrial production. The proximity fuse demonstrated that scientific research combined with massive industrial capacity could produce weapons that changed the tactical balance fundamentally. This lesson informed post-war American military doctrine, leading to enormous investments in research and development and a technological approach to military superiority that continues today. Japanese forces drew different lessons. Their post-war analysis concluded that proximity fuses represented a technological capability gap that could not be closed through determination or sacrifice. American industrial and scientific superiority had reached a point where Japanese forces could not compete, regardless of willingness to die. This realization contributed to the psychological groundwork for surrender. If technology like proximity fuses existed, what other weapons might America possess? The atomic bombs dropped in August provided a horrifying answer to that question. The human cost of the Okinawa campaign and the proximity fuse's role in it remains difficult to calculate precisely. American sources credit proximity fuses with saving approximately 10,000 to 15,000 sailor lives by preventing ship losses. Japanese sources acknowledge approximately 3,900 pilots killed in kamikaze operations at Okinawa, though the actual number may be higher due to incomplete records. The total naval casualties on both sides exceeded 15,000 killed, making Okinawa the bloodiest naval campaign of the Pacific War. For the families of kamikaze pilots, The knowledge that their sons and husbands died to technological superiority rather than combat failure provided cold comfort. Japanese culture emphasized honor in death, but there was little honor in being shot down at 15 kilometers range by shells that detonated automatically. The sacrifice was real, the courage was genuine, but the futility was inescapable. These young men died not in combat, but in what amounted to technological execution, killed by weapons they could neither see nor counter. The proximity fuse itself continued evolving after Okinawa. Engineers developed improved versions with better discrimination against false targets, higher reliability, and greater resistance to countermeasures. The basic principle, using radio reflections to trigger detonation at optimal range, remained unchanged. Post-war weapons systems, including surface-to-air missiles, anti-aircraft artillery, and eventually even tank ammunition, incorporated proximity fuses. The technology, pioneered in the early 1940s, became standard in modern weapons, with descendants of the original VT fuse still in use today. The strategic impact extended beyond the immediate tactical effects. Japan's failure to develop equivalent technology demonstrated the critical importance of sustained scientific research and industrial capacity in modern warfare. Nations that could not match American investment in research and development would face insurmountable technological disadvantages. This realization shaped Cold War military competition, space programs, and the general emphasis on technological superiority that characterizes modern militaries. The kamikaze pilots who flew against proximity-fused defenses at Okinawa represented the last generation of warriors who believed determination could overcome material disadvantage. Their courage was unquestioned, their dedication was absolute, but courage and dedication proved insufficient against shells that thought, guns that aimed themselves, and an industrial base that produced 70,000 precision electronics devices daily. The proximity fuse did not make kamikaze pilots cowards, it made their bravery irrelevant. In the final analysis, the story of proximity fuses versus kamikaze attacks illuminates the transformation of warfare in the mid-20th century. Combat was no longer decided primarily by courage, skill, or determination, though those factors remained important. Technology had become the dominant factor, multiplying the effectiveness of forces that possessed it and rendering obsolete the tactics of forces that did not. The kamikaze pilots learned this lesson in the sky above Okinawa, dying in confusion as their aircraft disintegrated around them, shot down by shells they never saw fired by guns they could not evade. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now and don't forget to subscribe.